Hey everybody, it's Timothy here with Mana Rocks, and this is part 5, our final guild for Ravnica Allegiance, our limited set review. Thank you for sticking with it and checking it out. I know there are plenty of reviews that go up around this time, so if you're watching mine, hey, I appreciate it. We're going to be looking at Simic, which I think is a strong favorite for a lot of people. People seem to just love Simic, and they really went overboard this time with the creature types. Unfortunately, their guild mechanic is not maybe the most exciting thing in the world, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's bad. Simic gets Adapt, which is a riff off of Monstrosity from Theros, and Conspiracy too, but nonetheless, Adapt is an activated ability, requires some amount of mana, and puts a number of 1/1 counters on the creature equal to the Adapt number. So for instance, the Aeromunculus below has Adapt 1, meaning you pay 4 mana, you put a 1/1 counter on it. There is a little bit of a twist with Adapt where you cannot adapt, or rather you do not get counters if the creature already has +1/+1 counters on it. So if you activate the Adapt 1 ability of Aeromunculus while it already has a counter on it, it will not actually do anything at all. Now, this means you're looking for ways to move counters around, right? Or you can use Adapt as an engine. We've already seen in Gruul a couple ways to put counters on things and remove counters from things, and we'll see a couple more here. Plus, there are just a few scattered throughout the set. So there are some engines that can be put together with Adapt, using the Adapt to kind of just put counters on board and fuel these other cards that need counters to work. Adapt is really good. And we'll notice throughout this video that Simic has mostly just strong playable cards. A lot of the creatures are good on their own, and Adapt just makes them a little bit better. And I'm surprised to see this, actually. I would expect a lot of the Adapt creatures to be a little bit weak on the vanilla side and then get better with their adaptability, but that's not quite how they design these cards. They're usually just solid on their own without Adapt, and they get better. Last note here is that I think Adapt is going to play very similarly to the level up mechanic from Rise of the Eldrazi, where if you have too many creatures on board with Adapt, and the Adapt costs all tend to be pretty expensive, you're probably going to have to use one adaptability per turn, and you have the potential to get blown out. You have the potential for your opponent to remove your creature in response or bounce your creature, so there's a little bit of skill involved with when you'll adapt, when it's right to adapt, when it's right to adapt which creature, when it's right to adapt versus playing a card in your hand. You get it, right? It's a little bit skill intensive, even if the ability is a little bit simple on its face. Starting off with our sideboard cards, thankfully we don't really have to talk about many of these very much. These are also our build around, and I'm going to go ahead and put Pteramander in this category. It's a single blue for a 1/1. It's an uncommon Salamander Drake. It has flying, and for 7 and a blue, it has Adapt 4. So 8 mana, Adapt 4 turned into a 5/5 flyer, but the ability costs 1 less to activate for each instant or sorcery in the graveyard. Now, this is a build around that you could just put in your deck without actually building around it too much, as long as you have a couple instants or sorceries. If you're paying 8 or 7 mana for this Adapt 4 ability, that's just super, super expensive, and you should probably bank on your other Adapt creatures getting there before Pteramander. However, if you do actually actively build around this card and you have a bunch of instants or sorceries, then Pteramander gets way better. I actually think this is an Adapt creature that might be better suited for Azorius than it is for Simic, since Azorius incentivizes you to draft a bunch of instants and sorceries already. Pteramander is fine on its own, right? You don't need that much extra work. Most of your decks, whether Simic, Azorius, or otherwise, are going to have instants or sorceries that you're going to cast. But the card gets a lot better when you actually build around it, when you start incentivizing instants and sorceries over other creatures and things of the like. So Pteramander's fine, but by putting it in this category, I don't mean that it's unplayable otherwise, but it definitely takes a hit if you're playing a deck with very few spells in it, and it gets exceptionally better if you're playing a deck that has a bunch of spells in it. Our low pick playable cards, and this kind of harkens to us saying that Simic has just really high quality cards overall. The only card I put in this category is Skitter Eel, and Skitter Eel is not even that bad. It's 3 and a blue for a 3/3 common fish crab, and it has Adapt 2 for 2 and a blue. So for 3 mana, you put 2 counters on it if it didn't already have counters on it. And that seems solid. A 4 mana 3/3 is not necessarily a bad card. It's just something you're not excited to play. And the adapt cost is cheap enough here that you're going to be able to play this on turn 4 and then adapt it on turn 5, and then maybe even play something else that turn and start attacking for 5. Adapt also highlights the threat of activation concept, where a lot of times you can attack with this and your opponent won't have something that can profitably block a 5/5, so they kind of have to let it through or just lose a creature. And if they let it through, you don't have to activate at all, and you can use your mana somewhere else. So it almost makes the creature pseudo-unblockable against certain board states. So I like Skittereel. This is probably the worst of the adapt creatures, and that's saying a lot, considering this card is just fine and playable on its own. Take note here with Skittereel and a lot of these other non-flying adapt creatures that Simic is going to have a little bit of an issue with Death Touch creatures, and there are quite a few Death Touch creatures floating around, so be careful how much stock you put into adapt if your opponent's playing a really stalled out game with a bunch of Death Touch creatures. And that brings us straight into our second category here. Thankfully, Simic has a lot to talk about, and we're going to talk about the medium power level cards. Remember that these are cards that I'm looking to pick up still fairly early in the pack before the wheel, but they're not quite in the bad category, right? I'm excited to put these cards in my deck. They're usually filler, and you're looking for a little bit better, but if you can pick them up before the wheel, you're pretty happy with them. Starting with Gyre Engineer, 1 green and a blue for a 1/1 uncommon Vidalcan Wizard, and it taps for 2 mana, green and blue. This is obviously designed for adapt, right? You could just run this in any deck and it's going to let you cast your creatures earlier, but having a bunch of extra mana on board is very useful when a lot of your cards cost adapt or have adapt abilities that cost 6 or more mana. Gyre Engineer is going to be a fine addition. I think this is the type of card you should never expect to wheel, so if you have a mana-hungry deck, this is going to be quite good. And there are also a couple X spells that we'll talk about towards the end of this video and in the final videos, where having a bunch of extra mana to dump into X seems really, really good. I'm thinking the Jellyfish Hydra and the Mass Manipulation card. So if those are cards that are in your pool, you'll prioritize the Engineer a little bit higher. I can also leave this card if I end up low curve, but I imagine even the lowest curve Simic decks are going to have a bunch of adapt creatures that you'll need extra mana for. Apply to Biomancy is Simic's kind of interactive removal spell. Apparently this is part of a cycle where each guild got a interactive removal spell, and I didn't really pick up that it was a cycle because they're all kind of different, but Applied Biomancy is blue and a green for a common instant, and you choose one or both. Target creature gets +1/+1 until end of turn, and or return target creature to its owner's hand. So I said in a previous video that 2 mana is where I like to have my bounce spells, and this is a 2 mana bounce spell with the added addition of having a mini pump spell attached to it. So already, if this was 2 mana return a creature, I'd probably play at least the first copy and maybe multiple copies if I felt like I was a beatdown deck or a tempo-based deck. But having that +1/+1 attached to it is quite nice. A lot of times you can use this to get an extra damage by pumping one of your creatures and bouncing a blocker, kind of taking away a blocker and having a huge swing for the turn. You can use it to interrupt combat, right? Bounce one attacker and then pump one of your blockers so that you can block an additional attacker. Something along those lines. You see the flexibility of the card. I think there are times where it's just going to be a bounce spell, and you can't really maneuver the +1/+1 to be favorable, but it plays out really well. It's also nice to know that in the mirror match, bounce spells seem really good, especially instant speed bounce spells seem really good against adapt, since adapt is often expensive enough that it takes a full turn to activate the ability, and you can blow those creatures out in response by bouncing back to their hand with cheap spells like this. Scuttlegator is next, 4 and 2 blue-green hybrid mana, 6 mana total for a 6/6 defender. It is a crab turtle crocodile, because why not? It has the Adapt 3 ability for 6 and double blue-green, so 8 mana total to Adapt 3, turn it into a 9/9. And as long as it has a +1/+1 counter on it, it can attack as though it didn't have Defender. I don't think there's anything wrong with this card. Having Defender on your 6-drop is a little annoying, but the stats mean that your opponent is no longer attacking you on the ground. And keep in mind, it doesn't necessarily have to adapt to attack. You can put a 1/1 counter on it through other means, and then suddenly you have a potential 9/9, or at least a 7/7 when it is attacking. And I think the fact that this holds down the ground until it gets to the point where it attacks is fine. You can play this in other decks as well, right? You can play it in Gruul where it's going to be a little bit worse because Gruul is a lot more about attacking quickly. And you can play it in Azorius where it's probably an okay top-end creature. I don't think there's anything exceptional about this card, but I do like that it's on curve and it attacks and hits very hard once you stabilize and get kind of to the late game, right? Simic is going to be a late game deck, and Scuttlegator is a common that you can put in, even though it's not super exciting. Keep in mind there are a couple other payoffs for having defenders in your deck. Not very many, but Scuttlegator is the type of card that can take advantage of those payoffs. Growth Spiral is next. This is a card I could actually take it or leave it, but I recognize that there's some real power level here. It's green and a blue for a common instant. You draw a card, you put a land from your hand onto the battlefield. So it's a ramp spell plus it cycles itself all in one. It's not like this is exceptional or anything, but as I stated with the Gyre Engineer, Simic is a deck that could take advantage of extra lands, extra mana, and getting ahead on mana for basically no cost. Just cycling a card and getting ahead on mana seems pretty good. So you've got kind of an instant speed explore type effect, not something that's worth splashing in other decks, since you want to cast this pretty early on for it to be effective. But at the very worst, it cycles itself into another card, even if you're not ramping with it. And I think the total combination of effects here is worth giving this a nod in the more powerful direction than the less powerful direction. Sorrowform Hybrid is 1 and a green for a 2/2 common human lizard warrior, because why not? And it has Adapt 4 for 4 and double green. Can't ask much more out of my bears here. This card is just fine before you adapt it. 2 mana 2/2 is nothing that you're going to get excited about, but it's something that you play in your decks quite often, and having it be a relevant late game creature is quite nice too. This is a common that you'll see quite often. It's probably going to trade off, but if it doesn't, it makes for a decent late game creature as well. It turns into a 6/6, so not much else you can ask for out of your 2-drops to be that relevant in the late game. Benthic Biomancer is a single blue mana for a 1/1 rare Merfolk Wizard Mutant, and it has Adapt 1 for 1 and a blue. So you can play this on turn 1 and immediately adapt it on turn 2 to get yourself a 2/2 that's attacking. In addition to that, whenever 1 or more +1/+1 counters are put on Benthic Biomancer, you draw a card and discard a card. Not optional, but it's a loot, so it doesn't really matter too much. The fact that this can loot on turn 2 can help you smooth out a draw. And keep in mind, the 1/1 counters do not have to be placed there from Adapt. If you have cards, just like with Scuttlegator, that put +1/+1 counters on this, you can use that as a way to kind of loot minus Adapting, right? A lot of times, if you have this in your opening hand, it's going to let you keep a little bit riskier of a hand since you'll play it on turn 1, Adapt on turn 2, and start beating down. Plus, you'll get that loot. So I like this card. I don't know that's a rare quality card. It's definitely not a bomb by any means. I mean, after all, I have it in this medium power level category instead of even the high power level cards. But I think it's fine. I think you'll play it every time you're in blue. And I think you'll be happy with how it works out, even if it won't be the strongest card in your deck. Our uncommon split card is Incubation Incongruity. Fun to say. Incubation is a single blue-green hybrid mana, 1 mana for a sorcery. You look at the top 5 cards of your library, you may reveal a creature from among them, put them into your hand, and the rest go to the bottom in a random order. So 1 mana to kind of dig for a creature is a fine card. If that was all this did, it probably wouldn't make the cut in my deck very often. It can brick, but it probably won't, looking at 5 cards if you're any sort of creature-heavy deck, and Simic will be a creature-heavy deck quite often. You can play this in Azorius, where I think it takes a little bit of a hit, and you can play it in Gruul, where it's probably going to be great as well, even though not as flexible to cost. But you'll play Incubation some amount of the time if you're looking for early game action or late game action. Honestly, Incongruity, you'll probably play just about as often. It is 1 green and a blue for an instant. You exile a creature, and its controller makes a 3/3 green frog lizard token. So, rapid hybridization that exiles instead of destroying for 3 mana. This is a card that I'm not really looking to splash in other decks very often, since a lot of times you'll be downgrading a creature into a 3/3, but you still have to have a plan for a 3/3, right? It's removal, for really big creatures or removal for very problematic creatures, but it still leaves a reasonable creature on board for the opponent. So you have to be a little bit cautious about how you use this, and you have to make sure you can deal with a 3/3, which isn't a back-breaking creature to deal with, but when you're simply replacing your opponent's creature rather than straight up removing it, that makes for a little bit wonkier situations where you might be getting beat down, and incongruity is not really going to be the best. Keep in mind that incongruity can technically work on your own creatures. If you need an extra attacker on board, or if someone slapped an aura that makes one of your creatures irrelevant, you can cast incongruity to turn it into a 3/3 if that matters enough. Incubation Incongruity seems like a fine card, not necessarily a reward for being Simic, since incongruity is not the best removal one could ask for, but I think the combination of abilities, like a lot of the other split cards, makes for a decent card altogether. The other split card here is the rare. It is Repudiate to Replicate. Repudiate is 2 blue-green hybrid mana, so 2 mana total for an instant, counter target activated or triggered ability. Now, that was all this did. I would never play the card. I would sideboard it against Adapt deck, since Adapt is, in fact, an activated ability. Afterlife is a triggered ability. Riot is a triggered ability, right? You see where I'm going with this. Repudiate by itself can counter some of the actual guild mechanic abilities. Keep in mind, Spectacle is not a triggered ability. It just happens. It does not interact with Repudiate at all. But if that was all this card did, it would be kind of a waste of a card to just kind of stop someone from adapting once or doing something along those lines, right? You don't want to use a whole card to shut off an adapt ability that can be activated again, or a Guild Mage's activation, or anything along those lines, right? Stifle is just not a card that I'm excited about in Limited. However, the second half kind of saves it here. Replicate is 1 green-blue for a sorcery. Create a token that's a copy of target creature you control. Worth noting for newer players, if you copy a creature that has +1/+1 counters on it, or something that's adapted, the copy will not get those counters, but will have all the same abilities and whatnot. Now, Repudiate is nice to have as a bonus attached to Replicate, but I do think Replicate is the key card here. It's kind of like that mirror image card from M19, where it's a 3-mana way to come down and copy one of your own creatures. And I found with that card that even though that was an uncommon, there are times that you can't actually cast that card profitably, right? If you have no board at all, it doesn't do anything. If your opponent can blow you out in response, it starts to look pretty bad, right? If your opponent's playing a deck with a bunch of bounce spells or instant speed removal spells, then Replicate starts to look a little bit worse. But for the most part, you can bank on this at least copying a decent creature in your green-blue deck. You might even splash this in Gruul when you have generally bigger creatures that don't have Adapt. And I think Replicate is a card that you're happy to take, and Repudiate will come up some small amount of the time. Kind of reminds me of Disallow from, was it Ether Revolt or Kaladesh, where you would use it as a counterspell majority of the time, but you had the option to use the Stifle ability when it came up. Steeple Creeper is next. This is our activated ability creature for Simic. It is 2 and a green for a 4/2 common frog snake, and for 3 and a blue, it gains flying until end of turn. Now, I like this card. You could actually play this in Gruul and not have any blue mana in your deck, and it would be fine, even though I would look to probably splash maybe a Simic Guildgate or a Gruul Guildgate or something like that. Something that gave me access to the blue mana if I was playing this in a green-red deck. But a 3-mana 4/2 is something that deck might be interested in, especially when it has multiple fight effects, and that tends to play out very well with a 4/2. However, this card is obviously much better in Simic, when you can reliably activate its ability, and giving this thing flying and attacking for 4 is quite nice. Plus, it gives you some defensive options, right? I've already mentioned how Orzhov and Azorius have big flyers as kind of their finishers, and if you can jump this and trade it off, that's going to feel, I think, just fine, right? So Steeple Creeper is not exactly a super high pick, and it's not really a low pick either. It falls kind of right in the middle for me. Speaking of high pick, let's go and talk about the cards that are the ones you're looking to pick up very early in the pack, because you know you're not going to get much of another chance to get them. So when you open a bomb, these are the cards you're hoping to get passed to you, even though they're not necessarily the cream of the crop when it comes to the set. The first one being Prime Speaker Vannifar. Maybe I'm rating this lowly. I don't know. It's kind of hard to tell how this card will work out. It asks you to draft very differently. If you don't know, Vannifar is 2 green and a blue for a 2/4 mythic legendary elf ooze wizard. Okay. And it has the Birthing Pod ability. You can tap it, sack another creature, and search your library for a creature with converted mana cost equal to the sacrifice creature's mana cost +1. So if you sack a 4-drop, you get to fetch up a 5-drop. If you sack a 2-drop, you get to fetch up a 3-drop, so on and so forth. You shuffle your library afterwards, you put that creature on the battlefield, and you can only activate this at sorcery speed. So, quite literally, Birthing Pod, right? Now, this requires a couple things. First off, you have to make sure that you have creatures all along the curve in your deck, starting at probably like 2 or 3 drop. You don't really necessarily need 1 drops to make this work, but if you want this card to function, then you need like multiple 5s or 6 drops in your deck. Prime Speaker must sacrifice another creature as well. She can't sacrifice herself. When this card gets actually good is when you have really, really good top-end creatures that are worth just slamming on the battlefield. You pay 5 mana for a 5/5, you immediately activate Vannifar, you morph it into a 6-drop, and if that 6-drop is really good, you get to cheat on mana a little bit, right? But you still had to pay 5 mana for the initial creature you sacrifice, so it's not like you're necessarily casting the creature for free. Vannifar gets a lot better if you have creatures with activated abilities. Rather, not activated abilities, but into the battlefield abilities. And Vannifar is a good way to take advantage of creatures that have had auras slapped on them where they're no longer super relevant, and there are quite a few of those auras floating around. Vannifar asks that you build your deck in a certain way, so I don't think this is a bomb, and sometimes Vannifar won't even be that good, right? You'll have a couple vanillas at the top end, you'll have some creatures with adapt and stuff like that, where they're just good on board, so you don't necessarily want to sacrifice them. And it's not like this is an instant speed effect where you can blank your opponent's removal, but I think Vannifar is going to play out just fine as it is, even if I don't think it is one of the more exceptional cards in the set. All right, let's talk about this bad boy, because I feel like this is one of the cards I would get the most backlash for. Hydroid Krasis is X green blue for a 0/0 mythic jellyfish Hydra beast. Not sure why it had to be a beast. When you cast this spell, you gain half X life and draw half X cards, and you round down each time. Flying and trample, and it enters battlefield with X +1/+1 counters on it. So, this is a card that people keep telling me, wow, what a limited bomb, what an absolute card. You can't beat this in limited. And I kind of scratch my head and wonder, like, what exactly they're thinking when they say that. So let's go ahead and just analyze this card for a second. At its base, you can't really cast this for 1 mana, right? For green, blue, and 1, you're not going to draw anything, you're not going to gain any life, and this will be a 3 mana 1/1, which is terrible, right? Anytime you pay an odd amount of mana for X, it feels like you're probably going to lose out on something because the life gain and the card draw is rounded down. The first time you'll draw is if you pay 2 mana for X, so it'll be green, blue, 2 for a 2/2 that comes in, draws you a card, and gains you a life. That's also not very good of a card. Flying and trample add to it a little bit, but trample doesn't really matter until you get to really, really big numbers, right? At 5 mana, X is 3, you're not getting really anything more than 2 mana, or X is 2 other than another counter. And then when this card actually gets decent is when you pay X is 2, right? Or rather, X is 4. So if you spend 6 mana total on this card, X is 4, then you're going to gain 2 life and draw 2 cards, and you will have a 4/4 on board. That, to me, seems like a strong card, although still not like a mythic rare I won the game card. Divination, little bit of life gain attached to a 6 mana 4/4 is good, and you'll play that, but that doesn't win you the game, right? And then people go crazy and they say, oh, well, if you cast it, X is 6, and you pay 8 mana total, then you gain 3 life and draw 3 cards. And yeah, I guess that's good, right? That's actually pretty strong in my opinion, but that's 8 mana before it gets to a point where I feel like this card is an actual straight up bomb. And 8 mana is not trivial. Sure, you're in Simic, you can ramp to it sometimes, but you can't reliably always cast 8 drops in a deck that has multiple archetypes built around completely beating you down, right? It's not like this card has flash or anything. You have to tap out for it, it could just die, and then yeah, you have kind of a divination or a Jace's Ingenuity attached to it, but if you're getting beat down, you just spent your 8 mana on a 6/6. There are like 5 mana 6/6s in this set. I don't know. I don't think this is a bomb. I think it's a very strong card, but I don't think it's even a good card, really, until you cast it for 6 or more mana. Obviously, if you're a ramp deck, if you can reliably cast it for 8 mana, if you can cast it for even more than that, or you know you're going to stay alive to the point where you can cast this card, then yes, it's really strong. But I don't think it's a bomb at any point other than X is 6, and I think that's a little bit of a pipe dream to assume that you're always going to cast this for 8 mana. So that's why I put this in the high power level category, not the bomb category. But I might be wrong. I'm sure when my opponent plays this for basically any amount, I'm going to groan a little bit. But there are times where you can't really reliably get this out for the large amounts of X that you want to play it for. And there's some awkwardness with casting it for an odd amount where you feel like you're losing out on something, right? All right, enough about the controversial creases. Let's talk about Simic Ascendancy. Green-blue for a rare enchantment. For 1 green and a blue, you may activate it and put a 1/1 counter on a creature you control. That's the important part here, and that's why it's in the high power level category. 2 mana enchantment's pretty easy to get down. Once you get to the late game or once you get to the mid game where you've got kind of a board presence, you can activate this ability to throw counters around, and that's quite good. Keep in mind, it's a little bit awkward with your adapt creatures since you don't necessarily want to put counters on those creatures until after they've already adapted, since putting a counter on them will stop your ability to adapt them. But for the most part, on your non-adapt creatures and your creatures that have already activated their adaptability, already have counters on it, this is a good way to just pump extra counters out, especially once you get to 6 mana and you can double activate it. This is probably your whole game plan by itself. It has some extra text that doesn't matter too much. It says whenever 1 or more 1/1 counters are put on a creature you control, you put that many growth counters on the Ascendancy. And then during your upkeep, if the Ascendancy has 20 or more counters on it, you win the game. Now, the thing is, if you've put 20 +1/+1 counters on your creatures, you better be winning that game, otherwise something seriously weird has happened. I could see some really weird situations where the board is completely stalled, and you have some sort of engine going where you adapt a creature, remove the counters, adapt the creature, remove the counters, and that puts a bunch of growth counters on the Ascendancy. But for the most part, the Ascendancy is going to win the game without its ability long before you put the 20th +1/+1 counter on a creature you control. So Simic Ascendancy is really centered around the activated ability of the card. It's another reason that enchantment removal should be at a pretty high premium here. It's even somewhat splashable in other decks since you don't necessarily have to play it on turn 2 for it to be relevant. You're probably not activating it on turn 3 or 4 very often. It seems like a good late game mana sink for mostly Simic decks, but other decks as well. So gets a little bit of a thumbs up from me. Combine Guildmage is our Simic Guildmage, green-blue for a 2/2 uncommon Merfolk Wizard. For 1 and a green, you may tap it, and this turn, each creature you control enters the battlefield with a 1/1 counter on it. Again, kind of awkward with Adapt, right? You don't want your Adapt creatures to already come in the battlefield with a 1/1 counter on them because that stops their ability to adapt afterwards. So got to be careful about what creatures you're actually putting into play. And of course, you're not forced to use this ability, right? You could always play an adapt creature and then activate the Guild Mage before you play non-adapt creatures. But again, a little bit of awkwardness there with the non-bow of adapt creatures and putting 1/1 counters on them with other effects. The second ability of the Combine Guildmage is 1 and a blue, tap it, move a 1/1 counter from target creature you control onto another target creature you control. Now that's what we're asking about. That's what we're looking for, right? Ways to move counters around. This does 2 things. First off, it takes counters off of creatures with Adapt, which lets you adapt them again and kind of stockpile a bunch of counters on the board, right? Honestly, moving a counter from one creature to another doesn't add any power to the board, and it kind of functionally changes the power and toughness of all your creatures, so it can be used as a combat trick, or at least an on-board combat trick. But this lets you adapt again and kind of build up counters over time, even if it is a little bit wonky and expensive of a engine, right? But this also lets you trigger some of the abilities that just care about you putting 1/1 counters on creatures, not necessarily for adapt reasons, but if you look at like the Scuttlegator and the Benthic Biomancer or whatever the 1-drop was called, they only care when 1/1 counters are put on them, right? Not necessarily when they adapt. So Combine Guildmage can take counters from other creatures, put them on those creatures, and have them become live triggered abilities or live creatures. In the case of something like Scuttlegator, you can move a counter from something else onto the Scuttlegator, and suddenly it can attack as a 7/7. So I like the flexibility of the Combine Guild Mage. It feels more like a combo-y type card, or an engine type card, than a lot of the other guild mages. Those ones seem like more flexibility based, more kind of versatile in their abilities. Combine Guild Mage seems a little bit more combo-y, as I've already stated. So I like the card. I think it's going to play out quite well, and I think Simic will be happy to have this one. Next up is Biomancer's Familiar. It's green and a blue for a 2/2 rare mutant. And that's it. You know, the set that gave us Jellyfish Hydra Beast has a straight up mutant in it. Anyway, two abilities here. The first is Training Grounds. Your creature's activated abilities cost 2 less to activate, but you can't reduce that ability to less than 1, right? Plus, you still have to pay colored mana and so on and so forth. But this lets you activate your adapt abilities very cheaply. If you have 2 adapt creatures on board and you can activate them both with the Biomancer's Familiar out, you're saving on 4 mana that turn and probably building up a pretty huge board with that alone. So I love this already with just the Training Grounds ability, but there's an activated ability as well. You may tap the Biomancer's Familiar, and it says the next time target creature adapts this turn, it adapts as though it had no +1/+1 counters on it at all. So you can use this to adapt a creature that already has +1 counters on it and make it huge. This only works once per turn, since it says the next time it adapts this turn, not whenever it adapts this turn. So you can activate an adapt cost again and kind of store up counters on that creature over time. This lets you play around Adapt's own ability, right? And I think the combination of abilities here is quite nice. Mana reduction to turn your creatures into big creatures, and the activated ability, which lets you build that creature even bigger over time. Especially if you have one of those creatures that cares about getting 1/1 counters on it, maybe that triggers something, maybe something happens there, then the Biomancer's Familiar is going to feel that. Again, similar to the Combine Guild Mage, Biomancer's Familiar feels like it has a little bit of a combo edge to it, and I really love that about Simic, right? You get these high-end rares and uncommons that make the deck tick, and suddenly your big beatdown creature deck has a little bit of trickiness to it, and I like that quite a bit. Keep in mind, Adapt is instant speed, and Biomancer's Familiar is an activated ability, so this lets you adapt pretty cheaply and maybe multiple times on the same turn. You can activate Adapt once, then activate Biomancer's Familiar, and then activate Adapt again on that same creature for even cheaper that time, and toss a bunch of 1/1 counters on a creature. It's all on board, your opponent sees it coming, but Biomancer's Familiar gives you a lot of flexibility when you have multiple Adapt creatures on board. Frilled Mystic is next. I'm excited to lose to this card. It's green, green, blue, blue for a 3/2 uncommon elf wizard, and it has flash, and when it enters battlefield, you may counter target spell. A little bit weird that this is a May ability. I assume that's in case you are casting a spell and your opponent responds or something, and then you respond with this, and then they remove their spell from the stack. I don't really know, but anyway, this is kind of a glorified Mystic Snake. 4 mana, 3/2 counter spell on a 3/2 flash. It seems really strong to me, right? This is, in my opinion, by far the strongest of the CCDD cycle in this set. I think the Rakdos one is slightly far behind this, but Frilled Mystic seems insane. It adds a reasonable amount of power to the board at instant speed while also counter an opponent's spell. Can't ask for much else, right? Mystic Snake is a rare for a reason, and clearly this is uncommon because the mana cost is super restrictive, but this is the type of card that I would actually probably first pick and be very happy to kind of push my way into Simic if it's open. Shark Crab is next. Wonderful name. It's 2 green and a blue for a 4/4 uncommon fish octopus crab. For 2 green and a blue, it adapts 1. So 4 mana for a 4/4 is already pretty strong, and then adapt is gravy on top of that, right? Turn it into a 5/5 is not trivial for 4 mana, also not too bad of an adapt cost. And it has a triggered ability. Whenever 1 or more +1/+1 counters are put on Shark Crab, tap target creature in opponent's control. That creature doesn't untap during its controller's next untap step. Wow, that seems like a complete beat-in to me. First off, on its own, this can already adapt on turn 5. Attack is a 5/5 and lock down a blocker for that turn plus the following turn. Plus, if you have any of these combo-y type cards I keep talking about, like the Combine Guild Mage, suddenly you can possibly move counters onto Shark to Crab. Or if you have any instants or sorceries that put counters on the Shark to Crab, you just get to lock down your opponent's creatures. Yeah, this has possible mythic uncommon attached to it right here. I'm calling it, this is one of the best uncommons in the set, and it doesn't really even take that much work, right? The fail case is that you get a 4-mana 4/4 that has its own activated ability to trigger it at least once and turn into a 5/5. Plus, the adaptability seems very fairly costed, right? 4 mana is probably going to take up your whole turn, but if it means you're attacking with a bunch of creatures that your opponent was walling off with something, seems really strong to me. So Shark to Crab gets the double thumbs up from me. It seems very strong. And in a pack that doesn't really have like a super strong bomb rare, I'm probably first picked in Shark to Crab every time. Next up is our Galloping Lizrog, lizard frog, I'm assuming. It is actually a frog lizard. It's 3 green blue for a 3/3 uncommon frog lizard. It has trample, and when it enters the battlefield, you may remove any number of 1/1 counters from among all of the creatures you control, and you put twice that many +1/+1 counters on the Lizrog. A little bit interesting here that if the Lizrog actually comes in with counters from an effect like the Combine Guild Mage, that you can actually remove the counters from itself and it will get twice that many counters. But it's a little bit of a digression there. Galloping Lizrog seems really good to me. You really only need to move 1 counter off of something to turn this into a 5/5 trample, and sometimes it'll be much bigger than that. This is another way to kind of combo out with your adapt creatures, right? You adapt them and then you move a bunch of counters off of them onto the Lizrog. The Lizrog becomes a huge trampler. Again, 1 counter is enough to make this a good card. 5 mana 5/5 trample is pretty good. Anything more than that, and you're getting kind of a busto card, in my opinion. Imagine Shark to Crab into Lizrog, right? You have Shark to Crab to lock creatures down. You have Lizrog to move the counter off the Shark to Crab. You adapt again, and you just get these giant creatures that control the flow of combat. Anything more than 2 counters, and I think Lizrog is actually approaching bomb territory, but it's not quite in that spot since it does require you to actually have +1/+1 counters on board to be good. 5 mana 3/3 trample is a huge hit from a potential 5 mana 5/5 trample. Keep in mind too, if you have a single creature with a counter on it and you cast the Lizrog, your opponent might just remove that creature with a counter in response, and that really diminishes what the Lizrog can do. Plus, you could say Lizrog, so there's not much else to complain about here, but I think this card and Shark to Crab are going to be 2 of the highlight uncommons for Simic. Moving, we have more super powerful Simic cards. Growth Chamber Guardian is 1 in a green for a 2/2 rare elf crab warrior, because why not? 2 in a green for Adapt 2, so we can almost ignore the last ability here, but if we just look at that, it's a 2 mana 2/2, so a bear with 2 in a green to Adapt 2. So this can attack for 4 on turn 3. We already looked at the common. That was a 2 mana 2/2 with Adapt 4 for 6. And the Growth Chamber Guardian is very similar to that, and possibly even better since it becomes a 4/4 very early on. That's not a creature that a lot of decks can tussle with early on. Now, just for the sake of completion, we'll read the last ability. Whenever 1 or more 1/1 counters are put on Growth Chamber Guardian, you may search your library for another Growth Chamber Guardian and put it in your hand. This is a rare, so that won't come up too often, but maybe in Steel, 2-headed Giant, something like that, you can go ahead and chain some Growth Chamber Guardians together, but even then, you don't need that last ability for this card to be good. It's just a solid beater. It doesn't do anything super fancy or anything extraordinary, but it's a nice pile of stats for the amount of mana that it asks you to spend on it, plus its adaptability, so thumbs up from me. Homunculus is next, 1 green blue for a 2/3 flyer. It is a common homunculus mutant, and it has Adapt 1 for 2 green and a blue. This is what I was talking about at the beginning of the video, where if an adapt creature is fine without its adaptability, then it's pretty good already, and the adaptability could be just considered gravy on top of that. 2/3 flyer for 3 mana is a card that I'm playing all day, every day, especially when the mana commitment's not super heavy, right? This could have easily been blue-blue-green or blue-green-green or something along those lines to make it more difficult to cast, but this is pretty easy to cast in a Simic deck, and it beats down in the air quite nicely. Plus, it blocks those pesky spirit tokens very nicely as well. And then on top of that, you have Adapt 1 to turn it into a 3/4 flyer, and that's pretty good as well. So This obviously curves nicely into its adaptability. You play it on turn 3, you adapt on turn 4, and you start beating down if you're not under too much pressure. And I like the design of the card overall. It's just fine without adapt. It's much better with adapt. Incubation Druid is another rare here. 1 in a green for an O2. Elf Druid. Where's my fancy creature type? Where's my Elf Crab Druid? Where's my Elf Bear Druid? A little bit of a disappointment. But anyway, it's a rare. It taps for any mana that a land you control could already produce. And if it has a +1/+1 counter on it, you add 3 of that type instead. Whoa, okay. And it has Adapt 3 for 3 in double green. So kind of neat that it can tap for mana in order to activate its own adaptability. So you could probably adapt this on turn 4 pretty reliably, and then untap and have just a slew of mana open to you. It is a little bit weak up to that point, but it does become a 3/5, which is a reasonable blocker, and on a mana dork, you can't ask for too much more, right? The fact that your mana dork can rumble in combat later on in the game is always nice. It is worth noting this doesn't actually fix your mana or help you splash very much, since it only counts mana that you could already produce off of your lands, but it does help you cast double costed cards. And honestly, if you're just a straight up Simic or Gruul deck and you're not interested in splashing, this ramps you, so it's fine. And it ramps you pretty heavily in the late game. There are some incentives to have all that extra mana, especially when it comes to Adapt and Simic. So overall, very good mana dork, card that I'm first picking quite often. And it is just mana, right? It's not an exceptionally strong card. It's not going to win you the game on its own, but it's going to get you to the point where you can win the game with your other cards. Keeping it moving, we have Skatewing Spy, 3 in a blue for a 2/3 uncommon Vidalcan Rogue Mutant. It has Adapt for 5 in a blue, and it has Adapt 2, so it'll turn into a 4/5, and it says each creature you control with a 1/1 counter on it has flying. I really like the design of this card. I'm not sure how powerful it is because it is a little bit overcosted as a 2/3 without any abilities, and the Adapt ability is very expensive as well, although this does turn into a very real threat once it does adapt. Anyway, I think the real crux of this card, the thing that makes it super powerful, is the creatures with 1/1 counters getting flying, which you don't necessarily have to adapt this card for that ability to work on your other creatures. So if you can manage to throw counters around on your other creatures and then play this, you might suddenly have a board of flyers that your opponent wasn't expecting. You might be able to just steal games with this card, and I think the potential is there, even though I think if this card didn't have the last ability and it just gained flying itself, it wouldn't be anything super powerful. I think overall, though, the fact that it can spread flying out to your other creatures does in fact make it a powerful card. And then I think even better than that is Trollbred Guardian, another card that might just end up being a mythic uncommon here. It's 4 in a green for a 5/5 uncommon Troll Frog Warrior. 5 mana 5/5. Gets a thumbs up for me. Solid card, solid body, nothing too wrong about it. It has Adapt 2 for 2 in a green, so pretty nicely costed adaptability. That means on turn 6, this can start attacking as a 7/7. And on top of that, the thing that really pushes it over the top is each creature you control with a +1/+1 counter on it has Trample, and that counts itself. So you're talking about a 5 mana 5/5 that turns into a 7/7 Trample for 3 extra mana on turn 6. That is a very strong card in my opinion. And it puts it gives trample to your other creatures that have +1/+1 counters on it. So you see a card that kind of bridges the gap between Simic and Gruul here. Gruul has Riot, so those creatures are going to be able to come in with 1/1 counters just because their own ability lets them do that, and suddenly they'll have trample as well if you have the Trollbred Guardian on board. And in Simic, your creatures have Adapt, so they have a way to put counters on themselves and suddenly become huge trampling beasts. So I think Trollbred Guardian is going to be a sick card to play with. On its own, it's already really good. It doesn't need help from your other creatures, but the fact that it can pump up a board to add just a ton of trample power on the board seems really nice. And again, similar to the Skatewing Spy, you don't ever even have to adapt this card for its last ability to be relevant. If you just have creatures on board already with +1/+1 counters, you can play this as a 5 mana 5/5, add that to the board, and suddenly all those other creatures gain trample as it is. And our bombs, our first pick, no fancy fade here. The only card I'm going to talk about in this category here is Zagana, Utopian Speaker. There were a lot of uncommons that we just saw that could end up being bomby first pick cards. Things like the Lizrog, the Shark to Crab, the Trollbred guy. They're all very good cards, right? And that really leads to the power level of Simic, just having that many strong uncommons. But I think Zagana takes the cake as the best Simic card, whether she's born or not. Commander players, I don't care. She's great and limited. She's 2 green, blue for a 4/4. Merfolk Wizard. She's legendary. She's rare. When she enters the battlefield, if you control another creature with a +1/+1 counter on it, you draw a card. So already you're getting a 4-mana 4/4, which is solid. And then the potential to just cantrip off of that, you're not paying any extra cost for that, right? You have to have a creature on board with a +1/+1 counter. But if you brick on that, you're still getting a 4-mana 4/4. She has Adapt 4 for 4 green blue. So 6 mana, Adapt 4. She becomes an 8/8. That's pretty huge, right? And 6 mana is not unreasonable for that. She's already a 4 mana 4/4. Like I said, that can already rumble. But for 6 mana, you get to turn into an 8/8. And each creature you control with a +1/+1 counter on it has Trample, the same ability as the Trollbred guy. It's kind of weird when you think about it, that they put that on a rare and an uncommon. But you're talking about a 4 mana 4/4 that turns into an 8/8 Trample, and potentially drew you a card when it came into the battlefield, and sometimes puts Trample on a bunch of your other creatures. Yeah, I think Zagana is the real deal here. I think this is Simic's best card, just flat out on power level. Doesn't ask you to do too much else other than be able to cast it on turn 4 and adapt it at some point. If you can't adapt this card, then it takes a hit, but a lot of times it'll cantrip, and that makes up for that. Also, very, very splashable outside of Simic, especially in Gruul, which is going to have those riot creatures we just talked about. Everything you can say about the Trollbred, Frog, Lizard, whatever it was, applies to Zagana since they have essentially the same ability. But Zagana is, in my opinion, an even more pumped up version of that card. So Zagana gets the triple thumbs up as best Simic card in the set and an absolute bomb that you should be first picking. And that's going to cover all of our guild here. So all we have all we have left are the monocolor cards and the artifacts and lands from this set. So if you didn't see a card in any of these guild videos, that means it wasn't really tied to a guild. So for the remaining 2 videos, part 1 and part 2, we're going to be looking at a couple colors at a time, and we're going to be going over all of the rest cards. These either don't have the guild ability on them, or they are not gold cards. So all of the monocolored cards that don't have guilds associated with them, we're going to go and look at them all individually, and we'll try to fly through them. There's a lot of basic stuff floating around, but there's some surprise hits. You're going to have your bread and butter removal. You're going to have some filler creatures. You're going to have a lot more low-end playables and a lot less bombs than we would in these guild videos, but we're going to look at them in 2 separate videos and kind of see where they all fall in line. Anyway, that's going to cover it for Simic. Thank you for watching. Again, if you're still here with me, I appreciate it. My name's Timothy with Mana Rocks. Stay tuned for our last 2 videos in this series, and I will see you all there.